This is the second part of me overanalyzing the exercises of arms by Jacob de Gheyn. In our last video, I discussed the book itself and the text as it relates to the drill of the musket, Caliver and Pike. This time I'm mainly going to talk about the equipment and clothing of the soldiers that are depicted within the book. So let's get started. When it comes to the equipment depicted in exercises of arms by Jacob de Gheyn, there's always one thing that jumps out, and that's the helmet. These days, this type of helmet is known as the De Gheyn helmet. As far as I know, there are no surviving examples, and within historical images, there are a few, but they are very rare, and it can be assumed that they were copied after De Gheyn. So these helmets could be pure fantasy, or they could have existed, but have been far from common. Within the book, most Calivermen wear their helmets tied under their chin. Some wear the tie is loose, and all of the pikemen wear their helmets also tied under their chin. And lastly, most of the pikemen have plumes on their helmets, and none of the Calivermen have plumes on their helmets. The pikemen are the only ones depicted in armor. This type of infantry armor would remain popular throughout the 17th century. The armor consisted of a breast and back plates, together called a corselet, with two removable hinged tassets to protect the loins. Some call these thigh plates, although most examples don't even come low enough to protect halfway down the thigh. All the cuirasses where the back is visible have a hook on the lower right side. This hook could be used to suspend the helmet from, but in practice this feature seems to have been rare. The tassets are decorated to look like they have individual lanes. In the 16th century, a lot of tassets did have individual lanes, but these are made out of a single plate. The decoration does add some extra rigidity to the tasset. In our last video, I mentioned the gorget on the title page. Here they are almost invisible. The gorget was worn to protect the neck and to distribute the weight of the armor more evenly over the shoulders. The gorget did fall out of use with infantry soldiers in the first half of the 17th century. Some soldiers are depicted with rapiers, other soldiers are depicted with what is called a field sword, or in Dutch a veldegen. Dutch edge weapons historian Jan-Piet Puypen describes this hill type as being the first true Dutch sword hilt design. And on a few images we can clearly see the suspension system with which the swords are worn. If you want to know more about the swords of this period, I've made 2 videos already. Those also will be linked in the video description about the swords in the 16th century and in the 17th century that were used during the 80 Years' War period. 15 of the 42 Calivermen are depicted with daggers, most with an S-shaped guard. Most of them also have a visible side ring, some with perforated plates inside of the ring. They are all worn on the small of the back with the hilt to the right side, in such a way that the dagger can only be drawn with the right hand. The musketeers and pikemen don't seem to be depicted with daggers at all. A sharp point on a 4.5 to 5.5 meter ash wooden shaft. If you want to know more about the different styles of pike points, I've also made a video about that. The link to that is also in the video description. But the pike points depicted in exercises of arms are more diamond-shaped or kite-shaped. Both firearms in exercises of arms are of the matchlock type, which means that the black powder is ignited with a piece of match cord, and they are of 2 types. I'm also planning on making a dedicated video about the firearms used during the 80 Years' War. So we'll keep the section of this video relatively short. The Caliver is a shorter, lighter firearm than the musket. It could be loaded either from a bandolier with powder charges, but because it used less black powder than the musket, it was most often loaded from a powder flask. The Caliverman also had a suspension system for his powder flask on his waist belt. The suspension system also featured a shot pouch, and there was a hook on the back of the powder flask that could be hooked in one of those leather holes. Both the priming flask and the powder horn are attached to cords, which are tied to the belt, so it was harder to lose any of the equipment. Both the Calivermen and musketeers have extra match cord tied to either their belt or their bandolier. The musket was the heavier of the two firearms. Because of this weight, it was used with a musket rest to steady the aim of the user while shooting. In the 16th century, muskets could weigh as much as 9 kilograms, and due to innovations in the beginning of the 17th century, they brought the weight of the musket back to about 5 to 7 kilograms. Because of this reduction in weight, the musket rest was used less and less until being completely discarded by the Dutch military in the middle of the 17th century. The musket was loaded with approximately 1.5 times as much powder as the Caliver. Due to this, it was a hassle to load the musket from a powder flask, and the muskets were almost always loaded from powder charges on bandoliers, and sometimes from paper cartridges. The amount of powder charges on a bandolier was dictated by the amount of bullets that could be made out of a pound of lead for that caliber of musket that the bandolier was meant for. They could be made of wood, but historically we also see copper and brass ones that are sometimes covered in leather. The bandolier also featured a priming flask and a shot pouch that is very similar to that one of the Caliverman. Some people claim that all the soldiers depicted are French and that all their clothing is French as well. I couldn't find much to support this theory, apart from the name of the bodyguard of Prince Maurits, who was a model for this book, which I mentioned in the last video. But apart from that, there was no proof of actually the soldiers being French or the clothing depicted being French as well. The clothing depicted is of the latest fashion for soldiers and young noblemen in the whole of northwestern Europe. So I cannot say that the style is particularly French, and there are also a few Dutch style choices and a few Spanish style choices, like the trunk hose on some of the pikemen. The flavor text in the beginning of the book I mentioned in the last video also states that the soldiers are dressed like soldiers of the time, not only because it looks good, but also to preserve how soldiers dressed in the period for later generations. The musketeers are depicted with a wide variety of decorated and plumed hats. Apparently, historically, there were a lot of issues with helmet requirements for musketeers. Local militia companies and mercenary companies did not want to cooperate with these requirements. There are only 2 hats depicted that don't feature decorated feathers or plumes. This seems to have been the norm for most soldiers, since especially plumes would have been expensive in the period and were mostly reserved for officers. One of the hats has a very interesting clasp to keep the brim folded up. 12 of the 42 musketeers wear earrings, most with a suspended pendant or pearl, and one with just a simple hoop earring. They seem to have been popular with some young men in Western Europe. For instance, this is a very famous image of William Shakespeare, also featuring an earring. But they seem to have been rare in the Netherlands as a whole. Most depicted soldiers seem to have broad collars around their necks, some with decorative pleating, others are fairly plain. These are most likely loosely sewn onto the shirt or into the doublet, and they could be removed for cleaning. And a few of the pikemen are even depicted with ruffs. The shirts that are worn underneath the clothing are most likely typical 17th century shirts, with relatively slim sleeves, since the tight form-fitting sleeves of the doublets don't allow for much bulk. And we do see a sliver of what is most likely the shirt sleeve near the wrist of some of the soldiers. For the rest of the clothing, I won't be going into the colors for two reasons. One being my own complete color blindness, and the second being that the pigments used for paintings and drawings were different than the pigments used to actually dye textiles. In that regard, the colors in period art can be used as a guide, but should never be seen as a rule. And there are reenactors that really like the sentence, "Paintings are not photographs and shouldn't be seen as such." A few of the Calivermen are depicted with relatively simple doublets or jackets, with thin wings on the shoulders and short and relatively short skirts. Most have 3 or 4 visible buttons at the end of the sleeves. And in some of the images it's clearly visible that the pattern is made with a bent arm, since you can see some bulk near the elbow. Some of the musketeers seem to have more flamboyant jackets with horizontal stripes or vertical slashes. The pikemen only have the sleeves of their doublets or jackets visible, some also with horizontal stripes. Some of the Calivermen and musketeers wear sleeveless waistcoats. Some of the sleeveless waistcoats worn by the Calivermen can be closed with ribbons, and it is possible that these waistcoats are made of leather. Where the waistcoats are untied, it's visible that the ribbons are only attached on one side and need to be fed through the holes on the other side of the waistcoat to close it. These waistcoats are relatively simple and sometimes feature a little bit of decoration. The other waistcoats can be closed with buttons at the front and often feature more decoration, like tape being sewn over the seams, and more heavily decorated larger wings on the shoulders. Some also feature skirts that consist of different flaps that can be buttoned together. The waistcoat is often partially opened to reveal the doublet underneath. Both the waistcoat and the doublet have a high closing color, believed to enhance the posture of the wearer. A few of the Calivermen can also be seen with a cassock or a ropilla. I have also made a video about this garment, which is also linked in the video description. They could be made from leather or wool, and could be used by soldiers to keep their firearms dry in foul weather. The sleeves are often worn on the back, and in some cases are purely decorative and cannot function as sleeves. There are a few different styles, but the most common form of leg wear seems to be pleated at the waist, and again gathered below the knee, some with a few buttons near the knee and some with buttons running all along the side, and some without buttons at all. Venetians are a different type of breecher. They're also pleated near the waist, but use less fabric down the leg, so they don't have to be closed or tied under the knee. Many of the breechers also feature decorative lines, most likely from sewn-on tape, and are mostly seen running down the leg or around the knee. This style of button fastening is only seen with some musketeers and some pikemen. Same goes for striped fabrics. 19 of the depicted images feature striped breechers, and this gentleman pikeman clearly thought that one row of buttons was not enough, so he needed at least 3 on one leg. Only one of the musketeers and 3 of the pikemen are depicted with slashes in the fabric of their breechers. 7 of the musketeers are depicted with disarrangement on the front of their breechers. Some have interpreted this as a fly, but personally I think it's a pocket. Flies with visible buttons are really rare in this period. If breechers had buttoned flies, they were often obscured by the pleats in the fabric, and often if there's a visible fly, it's not closed at all. Flies with visible buttons do become a lot more common in the middle of the 17th century. The possible pocket consists of a diagonal line, which can be closed with buttons and hoops, and they are all featured on the right leg. The first 7 pikemen are depicted with what are known as trunk hose, which is a heavily pleated and sometimes a filled piece of leg wear that is worn above the knee, sometimes with tubes that go into the stockings or hose. Most seem to feature decorative buttons on the side, and if you look closely you'll see ribbons with which the stockings can be tied to the trunk hose. Stockings are often called hose, which I just find really confusing since a lot of different garments were called hose. The stockings in the images look relatively tight, so I think they're probably knitted from either a light wool or even silk. Many of the soldiers are wearing 2 types of stockings of different constructions. We see a lower version and a higher version, and where the higher versions are often decorated. It is possible that these higher ones are made of leather, but this of course is speculaas. Though there is a source of a soldier on a Dutch East India ship who tried to bribe someone with leather stockings. Most of the soldiers are depicted with garters, a piece of fabric that helped the stocking stay in its place. And 3 of the pikemen have their stockings laced to their breeches. All of the soldiers are wearing relatively simple shoes without a heel. One soldier, a pikeman, is depicted with boots, but not riding boots. They have a flat sole without a heel, and they seem to be made of relatively thin leather. And yes, it's our friend with the massive amount of buttons on his breeches, so I guess he just liked to be extra. 24 of the 32 pikemen are depicted with sashes. Sashes were mostly worn by officers, but since these men are armed like the bodyguards of the prince, that would also explain their sashes. And all the pikemen are depicted with gloves, all with decorated edges. Well, this is the end of me overanalyzing the exercises of arms by Jacob de Gheyn. Please check out our other videos. There are some that are related to this video linked in the video description. And if there's anything I missed, if there's anything you'd like to add, please leave it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.